It's looking like the shortest limitation period I could find is 10 years. So, if you want to commit murder, you should live in Djibouti.
Thank you to Dashlane for sponsoring this video. New Year's. I don't know what it is about the Earth completing another rotation around the sun, but there's something about New Year's that makes anything seem possible. That wipes away the past and leaves a clean slate for the future. Never went to the gym? Now you can. Ate like a raccoon in a garbage dump? Time for a balanced diet. Procrastinated your days away? Well, maybe not that. But as much as I love a clean slate, I have to ask, do we always deserve one? So I watched a lot of cop shows growing up. I still do. Maybe that's why I'm a narc. But one thing that has always confused me is statutory limitations for crimes. If you don't know, a statute of limitation is just this time limit for anyone involved in an incident to start the legal process. So, for example, if you want to sue a dog for pooping on your lawn but you wait too long, you can't sue. And this makes sense because, one, I don't think you could sue dogs, but also two, if you really cared about the lawn poop, you would have acted sooner. Limitations stop people from acting on old beef. But what I don't understand is why this should count for crimes. Like, if you broke the law, you should be accountable forever, right? But limitations for crimes exist. Meaning, if you are not charged with a crime in a certain amount of time, then you are just not criminally responsible anymore. You could go up to a cop and be like, hey, you know that crime from a while ago? I did it. And they couldn't do anything about it. The only reason I can imagine this exists is because of time constraints. Like, at some point, cops need to prioritize new crimes, so the law sets time limits. But because I am often wrong, I have decided to try and find the correct answer. Here is the real reason why crimes expire.
So before we can actually figure out why something is happening, it's important to know what is happening, like the actual conditions required for a crime to expire. Unfortunately, laws are not the same around the world, but I didn't really think this was a problem. I thought I could just Google it, like country, crime, statute of limitations, bada bing. I got nothing. I really thought that there was some nerd out there who had already compiled every country and their statutes of limitation, but nope. So now I get to be that nerd. I am going to read every single penal code and or criminal code of procedure for every country in the world for this video. Let's do it. It's looking like the shortest limitation period I could find is 10 years. So, if you want to commit murder, you should live in Djibouti. Production value. Okay, I'd like you to meet my son. His name is Statute of Limitations for Murder Worldwide, and he's beautiful. Let's just... There we go. So basically, this is a database that contains the names of most countries, except for Greenland. I forgot about Greenland. My bad. It also has the length of the limitation period for intentional homicide. Now, you might be thinking, intentional homicide seems unnecessarily specific, but that's because you didn't spend the last 3 days reading penal codes. Basically, homicide means killing someone in any way. It could be an accident, it could be self-defense, but if somebody dies, you've committed homicide. On the other hand, intentional homicide, although a bunch of different countries have different names for it, but it basically means you intended to homicide. So there are two main reasons why I chose to record the limitation period for intentional homicide. One, doing all of the limitation periods would be really hard, and I'm lazy. And number two, in my personal opinion, but also in like legally speaking, intentional homicide is one of the worst crimes you could do, short of international crimes like terrorism and genocide, which like don't have limitation periods. But anyway, if a country is putting an expiration date on murder, it's kind of fair to assume that they're putting an expiration date on
every other crime as well. But just a list of countries and their limitation periods isn't enough, because we're trying to figure out why. We're trying to find this fundamental reason. So I dropped in a couple of other variables to consider. Maybe they're important, maybe they're not. The most interesting one, I think, is this variable: primary colonizer. Because I know that Canada used to be a British colony, and that is the reason for a few very distinct differences between us and the US, who did not like the British. So thanks to this really cool data set by a man named Paul, I was able to find the primary colonizer of most countries. So I popped it into some code. Look how beautiful it is! Look how cool this is! This is what the world looks like according to their limitation periods for intentional homicide. The darker the color, the longer the period. And if you're seeing a bit of a historical geographic pattern, you're not wrong. If we do a bit of a YouTube rewind and compare this to the graph of the top 5 colonizers and their colonies, do you see the pattern? The primary colonizer tends to influence the limitation length of their colonies. French colonies are commonly 10 years, Spanish, 20, Turkish, 25, Russian, 30, and the UK, limitless. And this historical influence doesn't stop there, which shouldn't surprise me, but it does. I guess I just always kind of assumed that the law was more reactive to modern climates. But at least with limitation laws, that doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, it was only up until pretty recently when modern countries like Japan and South Korea finally abolished their statutes of limitation for murder. So knowing how important the role that history and culture plays in limitation laws, I wanted to trace this back as far as I could go to the first official limitation law. And that means the library. Anyway, I love libraries. I used to go all the time when I was a kid, but then I stopped reading because school crushed my spirit. But it's wild that there's just so many books that you could just read for free. So I got reading. So here's what I learned. The earliest limitation law that I could find came from the Romans, and it had to do with ownership. It used to be that when you owned something, your ownership was legally protected forever. Sure, you could trade that ownership away in this weirdly extra process called mancipatio, which involved like 5 witnesses, a pair of scales, another dude dedicated to just holding those scales, and a copper ingot. If you didn't want to do that, person A could still just have a little trade with person B. It's just that ownership would legally remain with person A. And this made ownership disputes really confusing and unfair to person B. So, in 424 AD, the Roman Emperor Theodosius II was like, if it isn't in your possession for 30 years, it is not yours anymore. And that was it. That was where it started. Limitation laws were set up to simplify the legal process, which I kind of guessed. But more importantly, they exist to make things fair for all parties, because that is what they are ultimately about. Fairness. There's this quote that came up a whole bunch while I was looking for this answer, the reason why crimes expire. It goes like this. Statutes of limitation are designed to promote justice by preventing surprises through the revival of claims that have been allowed to slumber until evidence has been lost, memories have faded, and witnesses have disappeared. That is the real reason. Whether or not you're innocent, you have a right to a fair trial, and that means accurate evidence. It's really hard to defend yourself if that just doesn't exist. But there is this one other reason. It's the reason that confused me when I was learning about limitations in the first place. And it's that, yeah, if you are guilty, but the limitation expires, you get a second chance. It just took me days of research to realize that isn't necessarily a bad thing. In his book Reasons and Persons, the philosopher Derek Parfit put it this way: when some convict is now less closely connected to himself at the time of his crime, he deserves less punishment. If the connections are very weak, he may deserve none. Now, I'm not saying that they should apply in all cases. I still think crimes are bad, and some crimes are unforgivable, no matter how much you've changed and no matter how sorry you are. But It creates this subtle distinction for me. A statute of limitation isn't forgiveness. It isn't even really a free pass. It's a responsibility. It's a responsibility for officers of the law to work quickly, and it's a responsibility for guilty parties. They have been granted a clean slate, but they can never dirty it again.
Hey there, it's Editing Sabrina. So even though this video was all about forgetting crimes, our sponsor is all about remembering passwords. I'm pretty sure you've already heard of them, but in case you haven't, Dashlane is a mobile and desktop app that gives you a shortcut for everything you do online. It's more than a password manager. It autofills payment details and forms quickly and across all of your devices. Now, there's a lot of reasons I've always needed a service like Dashlane. Primarily, I always forget my passwords. I reuse my passwords. I always forget my passwords, but I've always been hesitant to get one. Password managers scare me because you're not supposed to tell people your password. That is like rule number 1 of the internet. But here's the thing. Dashlane never has access to your personal data. So instead of using cheap conveniences like login with Facebook that can misuse your data by selling it, do yourself a favor and get Dashlane. It's fast, it's easy, and it's free on your first device. Also, if you want a premium subscription, you could use my promo code to get 10% off. Check out the link in the description, but either way, have a lovely day.